The last thing I heard before feigning sleep in my own armchair was my granddaughter Lena, whispering to her husband about the day I'd finally be gone from this cabin for good. It was Sunday night. The whole family was here for a weekend sleepover, and the golden firelight glinted off her smiling face as she plotted my erasure. Her words were a soft, venomous breeze in the otherwise quiet room, a clear and undeniable sin delivered while I was still breathing the air she so desperately wanted to clear. I kept my breathing even, my eyes shut. The cabin was my sanctuary, built with my own 2 hands on land my father bought after the war. It smelled of pine, old paper from 1,000 books, and the faint lingering scent of Beatrice's rose potpourri on the mantel. The fire crackled, a familiar, comforting sound now twisted into the soundtrack of my own obsolescence. Every corner held a memory, a ghost, a piece of a life they were already mentally painting over with sterile shades of gray. The whole foundation will need redoing, Mark, her husband, murmured back, his voice a low rumble of agreement. And we can knock out this wall, open up the whole space to the lake. Think of the light, Lena. They spoke as if I were a piece of furniture, a temporary obstruction. They weren't just inheriting a house in their minds. They were evicting a ghost that hadn't even departed yet. The sheer naked entitlement of it all was a physical weight pressing down on my chest. Lena giggled, a sound that once brought me joy now sharp as broken glass. Don't worry, she said a little louder. Grandpa Henry's miles away. He barely hears a thing anymore unless you shout. I felt the heat of the fire on my face and a cold dread in my stomach. She was right. My hearing wasn't what it used to be. But their greed, their impatience, that I heard with perfect, horrifying clarity. It was louder than any shout. My gaze, from beneath slightly parted eyelids, drifted to the worn leather bookmark sticking out of my old copy of Moby Dick on the bookshelf. Beatrice had given it to me on our 30th anniversary, pressing it into my hand with a knowing smile. For your greatest adventure, she'd said. It was a simple, unassuming thing, a strip of faded brown leather. To them, it was just clutter. They had no idea it was the key to everything, that it was the beginning of their end. I took a slow, silent breath and thought of Beatrice. She had seen this coming in her quiet, observant way. She'd seen the subtle shifts in Lena, the growing avarice in her eyes long before I was willing to admit it. My wife was my compass, and even after she was gone, her wisdom remained. I clutched that thought like a shield, the only warmth in the room not coming from the hearth. They thought I was alone, but I wasn't. The next morning, the air in the cabin was thick with false pleasantries. Lena was a whirlwind of manufactured cheer, making me pancakes, fluffing my pillows. "Did you sleep well, Grandpa?" she asked, her smile a perfect, polished lie. Her eyes, however, darted around the room, measuring, assessing, cataloging every flaw she planned to eradicate. The contrast between her warm hands on my shoulder and the cold calculation in her gaze was jarring. She was an actress playing the part of a loving granddaughter. Over breakfast, she began her campaign. "You know, this place is a lot for one person to handle, Grandpa," she said, her voice dripping with faux concern. "All the upkeep, the stairs. Mark and I were talking, and we'd be happy to move in. We could take that whole burden right off your shoulders." The offer was presented as a kindness, a selfless act of familial duty, but it was a siege, a gentle, smiling invasion designed to slowly push me out of my own life. I just nodded slowly, taking a deliberate sip of my black coffee. I didn't give them an answer. Silence, I've learned, is a void that impatient people feel compelled to fill. They mistake stillness for weakness, quiet for acquiescence. I let her words hang in the air, unanswered, watching as a flicker of annoyance crossed her face before she replaced it with another bright, empty smile. Let them think they were winning. Let them underestimate the old man in the chair. For the rest of the day, I watched them. I saw Mark run his hand along a doorframe, checking for rot. I saw Lena subtly pacing the dimensions of the master bedroom, mentally arranging her furniture where my marriage bed still stood. They were like vultures, circling politely, waiting for the inevitable, with a barely concealed eagerness that soured the very air I breathed. They were no longer my family. They were prospective buyers, waiting for the current tenant to expire. I remembered teaching Lena how to skip stones on the lake, her tiny hand in mine. I remembered carrying her on my shoulders through these very woods. They believed this cabin was just an asset, an $850,000 property with a good view, a thing to be acquired and liquidated. But that was only half the truth. It was also a fortress, and I was about to pull up the drawbridge. With them on the wrong side of the moat. Their betrayal wasn't just about money, it was about memory. When they finally left that afternoon, the quiet they left behind was a profound relief. Mark clapped me on the shoulder, a gesture that felt less like affection and more like he was checking the sturdiness of a load-bearing wall. "Take it easy, Henry," he said, the casual disrespect of using my first name not lost on me. As their car crunched down the gravel drive, the cabin seemed to exhale, settling back into its comfortable, honest silence. Alone again, I moved through the quiet rooms. The scent of Lena's cloying perfume faded, replaced by the familiar grounding smell of old wood and fireplace soot. It was the scent of my life, of my history. They talked of airing the place out, but what they really meant was sanitizing it, erasing every trace of me and Beatrice until nothing remained but a hollow, stylish shell. They wanted the house, but not the home. They wanted the value, but not the story. I walked to the bookshelf, my movements slow but deliberate. My fingers, gnarled with arthritis, traced the gold lettering on the spine of Moby Dick. I pulled the heavy volume from the shelf. The old paper smelled of time itself. I slid the leather bookmark from its place between the pages. It felt cool and solid in my palm, a small anchor in a churning sea of deceit. It wasn't just a bookmark. It was a witness. It was an instrument. A week later, the phone rang. It was Lena, her voice a carefully constructed melody of warmth and concern. She was just calling to check in, to see if I needed anything. The lie was so practiced, so smooth. I imagined her sitting in her pristine, minimalist apartment, a checklist in front of her. Step 1, feign affection. Step 2, inquire about health. Step 3, pivot to the house. It was as predictable as the setting sun, and just as cold. "Mark and I were thinking," she began, right on cue, "about that leaky faucet in your guest bathroom. It could cause mold, Grandpa. We found a fantastic contractor who could come in and do a full remodel. It would be a real investment in the property's future." An investment. The word was a weapon, thinly veiled. She wasn't offering to fix a leak. She was offering to begin the demolition of my life under the guise of home improvement. "I'll think about it," I said, my voice intentionally frail. I let a small, weary sigh escape my lips for good measure. I heard the faint, triumphant smirk in her voice as she replied, "Of course, Grandpa. Just know we're here for you." They were here for it, not for me. The distinction was razor sharp. Every "I love you." This was their method, a death by 1,000 kindnesses, a slow, creeping annexation of my space and my autonomy, all wrapped in the suffocating blanket of their help. They would renovate my bathroom, then my kitchen, then my life, until I was a guest in my own home. They treated me not as a person, but as a problem to be managed, a final obstacle to their inheritance. The humiliation was quiet, constant, and utterly soul-crushing. After hanging up, I sat at my old oak desk, the one Beatrice had refinished herself. My hand rested on the cool wood, and for the first time in years it wasn't trembling from age. It was trembling with a cold, clear rage. It was the quiet, methodical anger of a retired teacher who had spent 40 years dealing with insolent children. And Lena, for all her adult sophistication, was acting like nothing more than a spoiled, greedy child. My study was my last refuge. The walls were lined with books on history, philosophy, and poetry. It smelled of ink and binding glue, a scent that always calmed me. It was the one room they never entered, as if intimidated by the sheer weight of knowledge it contained. Here, I was not a fading old man. Here, I was in command of facts, of timelines, of the intricate machinery of cause and effect. And I was about to cause a significant effect. From the bottom drawer of my filing cabinet, locked with the small brass key I wore on a chain around my neck, I retrieved the thick, sealed manila envelope. The paper was crisp, the notary seal a perfect embossed circle of crimson. It had been sitting there for exactly 5 years, since March 12, 2019. It was a time capsule, a landmine, a final, secret testament prepared for a day I had prayed would never come. Eachers and I had sat with our lawyer, Mr. Abernathy, and drafted it after my first heart scare. "This is for an emergency, Henry," she had said, her hand covering mine. "Forth they ever forget what family means. It's a fail-safe." Her foresight had been a bitter pill to swallow then. I had defended Lena, made excuses. Now, my wife's pragmatism felt like a final, loving gift from beyond the grave. She had known the truth of their character. I placed the envelope on the desk blotter, its weight feeling immense. I looked at the framed photograph of Beatrice beside my lamp, her smile captured forever on a sunny afternoon by the lake. "Well, B," I whispered to the silent dust-mote-filled air, my voice raspy with emotion. "The emergency is here. They've shown their colors, just like you said they would." The quiet of the room felt like an affirmation, a solemn agreement. My granddaughter's plan was simple: wait for nature to take its course. She sought tired, forgetful old man, a relic whose only remaining purpose was to sign his assets over to the next generation. She saw my quiet nods and frail sighs as surrender. She was watching the clock, counting the days, entirely convinced that this cabin, this lake, this life I had built, was the inevitable prize at the end of her patient, ghoulish vigil. She and Mart believed that time was their greatest ally, that the steady march of days would deliver everything they desired right into their waiting hands. But she had forgotten a most important lesson I ever tried to teach her, back when she was a child, doing her history homework at this very desk. I taught her that history is written by the victors. She just never imagined that the old man in the armchair was still writing his. 2 days later, they didn't bother to call. Their SUV crunched up the gravel drive unannounced, and before I could get to the door, Lena was letting herself in with the spare key I now regretted giving her. With her was a man in a crisp suit, his eyes scanning every beam and joint. "Grandpa, this is Mr. Gable," she chirped, her voice overly bright. "He's a contractor, just here to give us an estimate on that remodel we talked about." His handshake was firm, his gaze purely transactional. Mr. Gable wasn't a contractor. A contractor carries a tape measure and a cookboard. This man carried a leather portfolio and spoke in terms of market value and comps. He was a real estate appraiser, and they hadn't even bothered with a convincing lie. I played the part of the doddering old fool, nodding along as he pointed out the potential of the property. The potential, of course, could only be unlocked by my absence. They walked through my home like it was already an MD listing. The waterfront access alone puts this property well over $850,000, probably closer to $925,000 with a few modern updates, Gable said to Mark, believing I was out of earshot. I watched them from the kitchen, the smell of bleach from Lena's helpful cleaning still sharp in the air, overpowering the familiar scent of pine. They were literally trying to scrub my existence away. A cold, hard number had been placed on my life's work, and they were already counting the money, their faces alight with a sickening unified greed. Later, Lena sat me down at the kitchen table, a sheaf of papers in her hand. "Just some forms for the insurance, Grandpa," she said, her voice smooth as butter. "For the renovations." I feigned confusion, patting my pockets. Drat seemed to have misplaced my reading glasses again. I looked at her expectantly. "Could you tell me what it says, dear?" I wanted to see how far she would go, how deep the dissection ran. Her moment of hesitation was almost imperceptible before the lies began to flow. She summarized the documents, her words a masterclass in omission. She skipped over phrases like grantor's full consent and transfer of management, focusing instead on mundane clauses about material costs and liability. She was banking on my frailty, on my supposed inability to comprehend the words she was deliberately mangling. I listened, my heart a cold, heavy stone in my chest, as my own granddaughter tried to trick me into signing away control of my own home, piece by fraudulent piece. "I'll need to find my glasses first," I said, pushing the papers back toward her. Can't sign what I can't read, you know. Old-fashioned, I guess. For the first time, her mask of patience slipped. A flash of pure, undiluted anger tightened her jaw. It was gone in an instant, replaced by a strained smile. Of course, Grandpa, whenever you're ready. But the threat was clear. My compliance was not a request. It was an expectation. The game had just escalated from manipulation to coercion. Before leaving, she presented me with a gift, a sleek, black digital photo frame. "So you will be lonely," she said. She'd preloaded it with pictures, but as the slideshow began, I saw no photos of Beatrice, none of me as a young man, none of our life here. It was a curated collection of Lena and Mark, at their wedding, on tropical vacations, in their sterile city apartment. It wasn't a gift of connection, it was an act of replacement, a quiet, technological colonization of my memories. The next week, the real attack came. Chu sat me down in the same armchair where I'd overheard her whisper. This time, her tone was serious, clinical. "Grandpa, Mark and I are worried about you. Your memory, the bills, we think it's time we discussed a power of attorney." There it was, the final move to render me powerless, a ward in my own home. She said it was to protect me, but her eyes were fixed on the lake outside the window, on her shimmering waterfront prize. She slid the document across the coffee table. It wasn't a cheap online form, it was professionally drafted. They had been planning this for months. My signature at the bottom would effectively end my life as an independent man. I would be a ghost with a pulse, haunting the rooms they would soon own. I looked at her, at the granddaughter I had raised, and saw a stranger, a cold-eyed strategist who saw her own bloodline as a final, inconvenient footnote on a deed. This was the moment I was supposed to break, the moment the lonely, confused old man besieged by his loving family would gratefully sign his freedom away for the promise of being taken care of. I felt the four walls of the cabin closing in, the weight of their relentless campaign pressing down. For a terrifying second, I felt the despair they wanted me to feel. I seemed to have no allies, no moves left. I was cornered, and they knew it. I picked up the document, my hand shaking just enough to be convincing. "This is a big decision, Lena," I said, my voice soft. "Your grandmother, Beatrice, she always said to read the fine print." I let the mention of her name hang in the air, a silent judgment. Lena's face hardened. "Grandma's not here anymore, Grandpa. We have to be practical." The casual dismissal of her grandmother's wisdom was the final straw. The part of me that had been hoping, praying I was wrong, died in that instant. "No," I said. It was a quiet word, but it landed in the room like a thunderclap. Lena stared, her mouth slightly agape. "What?" she stammered, as if she'd never even considered the possibility. "No," I repeated, my voice firmer now. "I will not be signing this today." I slid the document back to her, my hand perfectly steady. The illusion of the frail, compliant old man evaporated, and in its place was something she did not recognize. Defiance. Her composure shattered. "We are just trying to help you," she snapped, her voice rising. "I don't understand why you have to be so difficult. This place is falling apart, and you're too stubborn to see it." Her concern had morphed into pure rage. It was the tantrum of a thwarted thief. Her frustration was the most honest thing I had heard from her in months, and it was a beautifully ugly sound. It was the sound of my first victory. She and Mark stayed the night, a tense, simmering silence filling the cabin. I went upstairs, claiming I needed to rest, but paused on the landing, concealed by the shadows of the hallway. I heard them talking in hushed, furious tones in the living room below. "His doctor told me his heart is weak," Mark hissed. "This stubbornness could literally kill him. If he won't sign, we'll have to talk to Abernathy about having him declared incompetent. We can't let him ruin this." Incompetent. The word was a declaration of war. They weren't just trying to take my home. They were trying to take my mind, my identity, my very self. Standing there on the dark stairs landing, the floorboards cold beneath my feet, I felt no fear, only a chilling, crystalline certainty. They had made a fatal error. They had mistaken my patience for senility. They had mistaken my grief for weakness, and now they would learn the difference. The next morning, I was the perfect picture of contrition. I apologized for being difficult. I told Lena she was right to be concerned. "You know," I said, stirring my oatmeal, "I have a checkup with Dr. Evans in town on Thursday. Could you possibly give me a ride? I don't feel up to the drive." Her face brightened, relief and triumph washing away the last traces of her anger. She thought my spirit was broken. She thought she had won. On Thursday, she drove me into town, chattering about her plans for a new kitchen island. I carried a worn leather briefcase, the same one I'd used for 40 years of teaching. It contained only two items: the sealed manila envelope from my file cabinet and the old leather bookmark from Moby Dick. When we passed the medical center, I said, "Actually, dear, could you drop me at Mr. Abernathy's office? It's just a block from here. I need to update some papers." The surprise on her face was comical, but she couldn't object without revealing her suspicious nature. She dropped me off. Her eyes narrowed. "I'll just be an hour," I said cheerfully. Inside, the familiar scent of old books and floor wax in Abernathy's office was a comfort. He was a good man, a friend for 30 years. "Henry," he said, his expression grave as he ushered me in, "I received a call from a Mark Jensen yesterday. I think it's time we proceeded." ... We sat in his leather chairs, the sealed envelope on the polished desk between us. I explained everything I had heard, every lie, every threat. He listened without interruption, his fingers steepled. When I was done, he nodded slowly. "Their attempt to have you declared incompetent is a serious miscalculation, Henry. It gives us the perfect legal justification to enact the codicil Beatrice insisted upon. It proves hostile intent beyond any doubt. Justice, it turned out, had a vocabulary." Mr. Abernathy opened the envelope. Inside was a document titled the Beatrice Addendum and a single ornate skeleton key. He explained the legal mechanics. It was a conditional codicil to my will, triggered by a specific set of circumstances, namely, a verified attempt by any heir to seize assets through coercion or legal challenge prior to my death. Beatrice, my clever Beatrice, had built a fortress of paper around me the moment they contacted me about your competency, Abernathy said, his voice grim. They triggered their own disinheritance. It's ironclad. He pushed a single sheet of paper and a pen towards me. It was a formal activation notice. As I signed, my gaze fell on a photo on his credenza, a school picture of Lena's 8-year-old daughter, my great-granddaughter. The innocent face looked out at a world she couldn't possibly understand. But that was only half the truth. The document protected her too. "There is one more step," Abernathy said, tapping the old leather bookmark I'd placed on his desk. "This is the cleverest part of Beatrice's plan." He explained how the bookmark wasn't just a sentimental object, but a key, not a literal one, but a legal instrument. Its existence, referenced in the addendum, was the final piece of authentication, the proof that the codicil was not a product of a failing mind, but a long-held, deliberate plan. When Lena picked me up, I was smiling. "Everything sorted?" she asked, her voice tight with suspicion. "Everything is perfectly in order," I replied, meeting her gaze in the rearview mirror. I saw her mistake me for a defeated man finding peace in his surrender. For the entire drive home, she was smugly silent, convinced the old man had finally updated his will in her favor. The quiet in the car was a prelude to the storm I was about to unleash. That evening, I called her. "Lena, I've made my decision. You and Mark were right. It's time to plan for the future. Please come to the cabin on Saturday at noon. We'll have Mr. Abernathy join us on a conference call, and we can settle everything." The elation in her voice was nauseating. "We'll be there, Grandpa. Don't you worry about a thing." Oh, I wasn't worried. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't worried at all. Saturday arrived, a crisp, clear autumn day. The lake was a sheet of blue glass. Lena and Mark walked in, their faces glowing with victory, like conquerors arriving to claim their prize. They sat on a sofa, expectant and eager. I sat in my armchair, the same one from that first Sunday night. The digital frame she gave me was dark, its screen blank. On the coffee table in front of them, I placed a single, sealed envelope. It was not the power of attorney. It was something else entirely. "What's this?" Lena asked, her smile faltering as she eyed the plain white envelope addressed to her in my familiar, spidery handwriting. Mark leaned forward, a frown creasing his brow. The triumphant atmosphere they had brought into the room began to curdle into confusion. The golden afternoon light slanted through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the charged air. "A final piece of paperwork," I said, my voice calm and even. "Consider it the new foundation." At precisely 12:05 p.m., I dialed Mr. Abernathy and put him on speakerphone. His voice filled the cabin, crisp and professional. "Good afternoon, Lena, Mark. Henry has asked me to preside over this meeting to ensure absolute clarity." Lena's eyes darted between the phone and the envelope. The trap was set, the door was closing, and she was just beginning to hear the click of the lock. Her carefully constructed world of entitlement was poised on the edge of a cliff. "Before you open that," Abernathy continued, "I need to inform you that on Thursday, March 21st, your inquiry into your grandfather's legal competency was officially logged. This action, as per a long-standing codicil in his will, triggered a specific and irrevocable series of events." Lena's face went pale. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving behind a splotchy, panicked mask. "Codicil? What codicil?" she stammered, her voice a thin, reedy thing. "The Beatrice Addendum," Abernathy said, his tone devoid of sympathy. "A protective measure your grandmother had the foresight to establish. It stipulates that any heir who initiates legal action to seize control of the estate prior to Henry's natural passing forfeits their entire inheritance, immediately and without appeal." Mark shot to his feet. "That's insane. We were trying to help him. You can't prove otherwise." His voice was loud in the small cabin, a blustering, hollow sound of desperation. "Oh, but we can," I said softly, picking up the old leather bookmark from the mantelpiece. I held it up. "Your grandmother knew you'd never notice the small things, Lena. The things that held memories instead of price tags." I turned it over. Faintly embossed on the back was a notary's seal and a date, March 12, 2019. "This bookmark," Abernathy's voice cut in, "is a legally recognized, notarized attestation, confirming Henry's sound mind on the day the codicil was signed." Lena stared at the bookmark as if it were a snake. The simple, sentimental object she'd overlooked 100 times had become the instrument of her ruin. All her schemes, her whispers, her fraudulent documents, undone by a strip of old leather she considered clutter. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the crackle of the speakerphone and the frantic, shallow sound of her breathing. The hunter was now the snared. "Now," I said, gesturing to the envelope on the table, "please open it." Her hands trembled as she tore it open. Inside was not a legal document filled with complex clauses. It was a single sheet of paper. On it was a copy of the deed to the cabin, but it was a new deed, filed with the county clerk's office at 11:45 a.m. the previous day. The grantee was not Lena, not Mark, but a newly formed trust. "As of yesterday," Abernathy explained, "Henry has transferred ownership of the property into the Beatrice Memorial Trust. He is the sole trustee for the remainder of his life. Upon his passing, the trust's beneficiary is not you, Lena. It is your daughter, Sarah. The assets are to be managed by my firm until she reaches the age of 25. The cabin would skip a generation, passing over their greed to land safely with the only innocent one among them." Lena's face contorted into a mask of pure disbelief, then rage. "You can't do this," she shrieked, the paper trembling in her hand. "This is my house, my inheritance." "It was never your house," I said, my voice as cold and clear as the laking winter. "It was a gift you tried to steal before it was ever offered. A gift you proved, beyond any doubt, you were unworthy of receiving." Mark lunged for the phone as if to smash it. "This is coercion. He's a senile old man, and you, Abernathy, you took advantage of him." Abernathy's voice was like ice. "I advise you to choose your next words carefully, Mr. Jensen. Every part of this has been meticulously documented. Accusations of professional misconduct will be met with the swiftest possible legal response. You have been checkmated. I suggest you accept it with a sliver of the dignity you denied your grandfather. But the money, Lena whispered, her rage collapsing into a pathetic whimper. The renovations, the value. Her mind was still stuck on the numbers, the profit she had already spent 1,000 times over in her head. She looked at me, her eyes pleading, searching for the soft-hearted old man she thought she knew. She found no one there. She was looking at a stranger. It stood up slowly from my armchair, the chair they had seen as my throne of helplessness. Now it was my seat of judgment. The same room that had hosted their whispers of conspiracy now held the public proclamation of their defeat. The golden light that had illuminated their greedy faces now silhouetted their downfall. Their quiet, private humiliation in my presence was the perfect echo of their public sin. The final document in the envelope was a notice, a simple one-page letter of eviction. The trust, as the new legal owner of this property, no longer consents to your presence here, Abernathy's voice stated flatly. You have been given a key for emergency access only. That access is now revoked. You are to vacate the premises immediately. Any attempt to enter without Henry's express permission will be considered trespassing. Mark stood frozen, his face a mottled canvas of fury and shock. He looked from me to the deed, to his weeping wife, his mind struggling to process the speed and totality of his defeat. He had walked in as the heir apparent, the future king of this small lakeside castle. Now he was nothing more than a trespasser, a common intruder being shown the door. The swiftness of the reversal was a physical blow. Lena was still crumpled on the sofa, sobbing. Not tears of remorse, but tears of loss. She wasn't mourning a relationship. She was mourning a $900,000 asset. The raw, transactional nature of her grief was the final, ugly confirmation of everything Beatrice and I had feared. She had never seen me as family. I was just a slow-moving obstacle between her and her financial goals. An obstacle that had just refused to move. Abernathy, I said, my voice steady. I believe our business is concluded for today. Indeed it is, Henry, he replied. I'll disconnect now. My best to you. The line went dead, leaving a profound and heavy silence in his wake. There was nothing left to say. The legal machinery had done its work. The truth had been spoken, the verdict had been rendered. I walked to the front door and opened it. The cool autumn air rushed in, clean and sharp, clearing out the suffocating atmosphere of greed. It's time for you to leave, I said. It was not a request. Mark grabbed Lena by the arm, hoisting her to her feet. She stumbled towards the door, her face buried in her hands, refusing to look at me. She couldn't bear to look at the old man who had outplayed her so completely. They stood on the porch for a moment, silhouetted against the bright afternoon. They looked smaller somehow, diminished. Their arrogance had been stripped away, leaving only the petty, grasping people they had always been underneath. They had come to claim a kingdom, and now they were leaving, with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the bitter taste of their own avarice. I didn't watch them get into their car. I didn't need to see their final retreat. Their presence had already begun to fade from the cabin, like a bad dream upon waking. I took the spare key from the hook by the door, the one Lena had used to let herself in, and tossed it onto the table. It landed with a small, metallic click, a sound of finality, a sound of peace. I turned back to the room, my home. The air felt lighter. The familiar scent of pine and old paper seemed to reassert itself, pure and clean. I walked over to the large window overlooking the lake, the view they had so coveted. The sun was beginning to dip towards the horizon, painting the water in strokes of brilliant gold. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the small brass key to my filing cabinet, and locked the front door.